When we're explaining the gospel to somebody else, sometimes it helps to illustrate and create a clear picture in the mind of how the gospel actually makes sense of the way the world is. And one of the best areas that we can do this in is with the problem of sin. Sometimes people have problems thinking of sin because they see themselves as a good person, or they think that they're okay and they're certainly better than this other person that they know, so things are okay. So when we tell them that we've fallen short of a standard of God, they can have trouble visualizing that. Well, one thing we can do to help them do that is to explain how the brokenness of ourselves and the brokenness of the world is perfectly explained by sin. And here's how we can do that. We can say, hey, you know what? You actually think, and we all think as we get older, that we ought to be better than we are. We ought to be a better person overall. We ought to be a better parent, or we ought to be a better spouse, or we ought to be a better friend or a better coworker. And that's why there's thousands and thousands of books written about how to be better in each of these areas. We all have this notion that we should or ought to be better. We also have this notion that the world ought to be better than it is. It ought to be safer or nicer or cleaner. It ought to be a better place than it is. And this is where it's a great time to ask that person, have you ever wondered why? Well, the Bible has an answer for that. And the answer is, you think you ought to be a better person because at one time, humanity was in complete communion with God. And that community has now been broken. And because of that brokenness, we're constantly feeling that separatedness from God, that once perfect state with God. And so we're striving in our own work to try to get back to it, but we can't do it. We constantly think we ought to be better, but we're broken. And it's because of sin. And the same is true for the world. We think the world ought to be better and nicer and cleaner. Well, the reason we think that is because the world was perfect. God created it perfectly. He created everything and said that it was good. But when we sinned, when we fell short from God's standards, the world also became broken. At one point, the world was perfect, and it isn't anymore, but we still feel like it ought to be. So the best answer for why we think we ought to be better than we are, is that at one point we were in perfect community with God. We think the world should be better because at one time it was. It was the perfect version of itself. And it's broken now, and the evidence is everywhere. And the reason why is sin. And then we can go in and explain what the consequence is of sin and move forward from there. But I just want to give you that quick illustration. I hope that helps you have discussions with others, because sometimes it just helps to create a mental picture to show that the gospel is both from the scripture, and it also makes perfect sense for the way the world is. I hope you find that helpful.